The history of African Americans, both slave and free, and their past relationship to the Ohio River in this Falls area is extremely interesting and important, and so it's very fitting to talk about this during Black History Month. The enslaved as well as free African Americans are central to the story of what we call the Underground Railroad and its relationship to the Ohio River. They've often been overlooked in that history, and emphasis placed instead on white people, often white people, who reached out to help. The longing for freedom began in the heart of the slave, and he or she was the most important component of what we commonly call the Underground Railroad. The slave was the one that made the first move and had the courage and the fortitude to try to run for freedom. Also, the story of the Underground Railroad has to be examined and told on a local level, as it changed from place to place depending on the politics, the religion, and the geography of any particular area. Thousands of the enslaved from the lower states and Louisville itself made an attempt to escape over the Ohio River in this particular area. And yet, besides representing freedom to some, the Ohio River also represented slavery to the many who tried but failed to cross it, and to the thousands who were shipped downriver to the southern market to work in the cotton fields. What a contradiction. And of course, this shoreline was an extremely dangerous place, and freedom seekers had to keep moving and leave the Ohio River Valley as quickly as possible. When talking specifically about the enslaved in Louisville in the 19th century and their search for freedom, we need to include this entire strip of Indiana shore that borders the Clarksville, Jeffersonville, New Albany area. And as Jean will be telling you about, also about Guinea Bottoms. Particularly in this area of the Ohio River, there was a large concentration of Kentucky slave owners in the Louisville area. And the struggle that freedom seekers went through to find a way to cross was extremely tricky and dangerous. As stated, it represented freedom and success to some, but if caught, downfall, hardship, re-enslavement, and sometimes death to many others. The 1850 Louisville Census tells us that there were approximately 5,000 slaves living and working in Louisville, with about 2,000 free Black people. So slaves in Louisville had opportunities to move about the city and could look across to our shoreline. To the enslaved, it would have looked like a pot of gold within their reach. But there were so many obstacles for the freedom seeker if he or she was to cross this ribbon of water successfully and then find a way to get further north. First of all, the river was a major highway and teeming with life, so they either had to figure out a way to use the available transportation systems or avoid them altogether. People, ferries, steamboats, skiffs that served as taxis were everywhere. Secondly, if your skin was a shade of black, it was assumed in this area that you were a slave. So free African Americans shared a common burden with the enslaved. And both slave and free had to carry identification. Because of the chaotic nature of the times after 1850 with the enactment of the Fugitive Slave Law and the 1851 Indiana State Exclusion Act, it became more and more difficult for slaves who had reached the Ohio River to escape without having some kind of passive or active assistance. Thirdly, owners had invested a lot of money in their slaves and were willing and within the law to cross state lines themselves or to hire slave catchers to follow. Police were always on the lookout, as were the ferry operators who were paid for turning freedom seekers in. There were a couple of major ways, though, that we can talk about briefly that enslaved were able to cross. Part of the key to crossing the Ohio River successfully was the fact that in both Louisville and on the Indiana side of the river, a large percentage of the free Black community worked in jobs related to the river. They knew the river with its various sandbars and snags and transportation patterns. In New Albany, studying the census records, I found that 25% at least of the black community in New Albany, Floyd County worked in river-related jobs. And it was probably true for Jeffersonville and Clarksville and Louisville also. One good way to cross was to find someone who owned a rowboat or a skiff and traveled the river at night. The most pristine place along the Kentucky shoreline that still exists today is the area around Portland and below the golf course. It is still today secluded with willow trees and undergrowth, and it has easy access to the river. And directly across in New Albany is Second Baptist Church, which was from 1850 until 1889, a New School Presbyterian church made up of anti-slavery black and white members. By word of mouth, freedom seekers would have known that they could find help there. And you know, before the canal was built in 1830, and when the river was low, that area down there around Portland would also have been a place where enslaved could have crossed without the need of help from transportation. Sand Island, I believe, was around where the K&I Bridge is now. There's one example I want to share with you of Violet and her children and her husband. Her husband was owned by one slave owner, and she and her children were owned by another. This is kind of a flat story when you're reading it in the paper, but believe me, it's full of emotion if you look on another level. Something must have happened in Violet's life to cause her such desperation to do what she did. Either her owner was ill and possibly near death. She maybe had fear that she would be sold and separated from her children downriver. Maybe he was going bankrupt, and she was again afraid of being sold. And she wanted freedom and wanted their family to be together. That's obvious because of what she did. She had the nerve to hire another slave who had a wagon and a horse, and at midnight, we're talking 1853, they were taken down to the Portland area, the shore that I was telling you about, but the Portland watchman, happened to either hear the horse or see a lantern, and while he was trying to apprehend them, there was a skiff that was seen coming from New Albany. And when he heard the commotion, whoever was coming, we don't know the person, but he turned around quickly and went back to New Albany. We do not know what happened to Violet and her children, but it wouldn't have been good. One good way to cross, besides using a skiff at night, would have been using the ferry system. We see a lot of examples in research of people using either steamboats or a ferry system to cross the river. Trusted slaves were often used by their owners as teamsters who drove wagons of produce across on the ferry to the Indiana side. The enslaved and free rubbed shoulders, loading and unloading as firemen, musicians, stewards, and barbers. Many escapes were those that happened right out in the open. And one example of that is of Isaac Throgmorton. He was enslaved in New Orleans, and in the summer his owner would bring him up with him to spend the summer in Louisville. Isaac was his barber, and so he had a lot of free time, and he would be meeting up with, rubbing shoulders with free people on the streets of Louisville. And one day he met and got to know a man who said, "Hey, why don't you come across the river to me to New Albany fishing?" And Isaac said, "Well, I can't do that. I don't have a freedom paper. I'm enslaved." So he said, "Oh, the ferryman. He and his son, they know me. I go over there fishing all the time." So that's what they did. They went, and the Connors asked for his freedom paper or some kind of identification. He didn't have it, but the other man must have been a quick talker, and he said, "Well, we'll come back. No worry, you know me." So they did that. They were allowed to cross into New Albany fishing, and they did that several times until finally the Connors trusted Isaac Throgmorton enough to let him go by himself. He went by himself, and in his memoir, he was interviewed. He finally made it to Canada and was interviewed there In his memoir, he said, "Freedom never looked so good to me. I went up the bank in New Albany, propped my fishing pole on a tree, and took the cars to Jeffersonville. And from there, then he finally, after months, made it to Canada, but not without lots of struggles." In closing, in the last 20 years or so, we all know that there has been a real upsurge in interest in the Underground Railroad. And one reason for that, I believe, is that our nation's been struggling more with the issues of slavery and those issues surrounding it. Studying the Underground Railroad, slave escapes, and stories of people reaching out to help has had a positive side to it and is maybe emotionally easier for us to deal with than some of the other topics around slavery. Unfortunately, out of that interest, the Underground Railroad has been romanticized and folklore has developed around it. Believe me, we all know there's nothing romantic about it. The Underground Railroad was only as broad as the mind of the slave and his or her feelings of desperation, bravery, and I might add pure luck along the way. In remembering the enslaved and those who assisted them in their search for freedom, we memorialize both and give credit to their efforts. Thank you.